Boldwood presents Coming Home to Puddleduck Farm. Written by Della Galton and read by Karen Cass. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. Phoebe Dashwood was still angry as she took the Cadnam turn-off from the M27 and the road changed from motorway to countryside. The air coming through the partially open driver's window switched from diesel-scented to the fresh, clear, unmistakable winter smell of the New Forest. Usually this would have been enough to soothe her, that blissful feeling of leaving the urban landscape behind and being in the countryside she loved. Beautiful Hampshire. But not today. Although she had to admit she wasn't quite as angry as she'd been when she'd left London at just after 8 this morning. She glanced at the dashboard clock. Barely 2.5 hours ago. She'd made bloody good time. Hopefully she hadn't gone through too many speed cameras. She hadn't been aware of any. All she'd been aware of in the mad dash out of the city that was thronged with commuters and people doing festive things was a desire to get away from Hugh. She'd stormed out of the Greenwich apartment they'd shared for 6 years with one hastily packed bag. It contained a couple of changes of clothes, her makeup, her shoes, her toothbrush, her phone charger, a small bag of Christmas presents, and her credit cards. She was already beginning to regret that she'd brought so little. She was going to have to go back again. Hugh would know that too, which was probably why he hadn't tried to phone her. Typical Hugh, he never acted in haste. Rational was his middle name. It made him a very good vet. Phoebe wondered if he'd gone into work, carried on as usual with his Saturday, and the thought that he may have done exactly that made her feel cross all over again. This was crazy. In her headlong dash from Greenwich, she'd only had one thought in her head. Get home, fly back into the warmth of her family, her childhood home, sit by the wood burner in the lounge and sip hot chocolate, while Dad complained about the neighbours' battle to see who could put up the most Christmas lights. But now she was almost there. She was suddenly full of doubts. Her parents would be pleased to see her. Of course they would. They wouldn't question that she was 3 days earlier than planned. But they would question the absence of Hugh. Her mother would take one look at her face and then hug her, and Phoebe knew that all it would take was one hug and she'd crumple and start crying. And once she started, she was afraid she would never stop. She needed to think this through. Work out exactly what she was going to say. She couldn't just turn up and pour out the whole sorry story to her parents. For the first time, she wondered if she had overreacted. If maybe she should have stayed, talked to Hugh, found out the ins and outs of it all. She wished she was more like her mother, who was a primary school teacher. She taught Year 3. Luella Dashwood was always calm and measured and would never make any decision before she'd thought through every option. Luella Dashwood would not have stormed out of her home with just an overnight bag, no matter what the provocation. Phoebe relaxed her hands fractionally on the steering wheel and sighed. She needed to decide exactly how much she was going to tell them about what had happened last night, and she also needed to stretch her legs. And she was in the perfect location for both. Making her second impulsive decision of the day, she turned left towards Lyndhurst, instead of right towards God's Hill where her parents lived. She was close to one of her favourite places, the Blackwater Arboretum, home to a selection of trees from around the world and part of the Rhinefield Ornamental Drive, was one of the most beautiful areas of the New Forest. Walking through the ancient woodlands never failed to lift Phoebe's spirits. 20 minutes later, she indicated to pull into Blackwater, parked beside a wooden picnic table, and got out of the car. She took in a lungful of fresh forest air as she went to retrieve the walking boots and Barbour jacket she kept in the back of her car. It wasn't cold. It was typical Christmas weather. Grey skies and a top temperature of 8 degrees. Average for the 21st of December, according to the weather notification on her phone, which also told her it was the shortest day. Good, Phoebe thought, as she sat on the open hatchback of her car, lacing up her boots and tucking her long brown hair beneath her hood to stop it getting too wet. There was less time to be sad. If you were going to feel heartbroken, it was definitely better to do it on the shortest day of the year than the longest one. There was a message from Hugh on her phone. She clicked onto WhatsApp. "I'm sorry. Please can we talk? Ring me when you get this." Hugh rarely apologised. Phoebe felt her spirits lift fleetingly before they dipped sharply again. Apologising did not make up for the fact that she'd caught him kissing another woman. Not just any woman either, but Melissa Green, who was the senior partner of City Vets where they both worked and also their boss. Melissa Green, who was known openly by her colleagues as Cruella de Vil because of her cut-glass accent, cool demeanour and fondness for Scarlet Lippy, was a hotshot vet. She was a trust fund babe. Her father, also a vet, had given her the prestigious practice 6 months after she'd qualified. Melissa had never seemed to mind the nickname Cruella, perhaps because it was better to be a glamorous baddie than to have Natalie Portman girl-next-door looks, Phoebe mused. But until last night, Hugh had professed to love her hazel eyes and long brown hair. He'd always said he adored what he called her understated beauty. Had that really been true? During the 6 years that Phoebe and Hugh had worked for her, Melissa had made Hugh a junior partner. Phoebe hadn't minded that her boyfriend had got the promotion and not her. It had been Hugh who'd got them both a job there in the first place, thanks to his father's contacts. Everything was about contacts in London. Until last night, Melissa had always been utterly professional with them both. She wasn't the type of boss who did heart-to-hearts, but she ran the practice with brisk efficiency, and she was fair, if a little ruthless. City Vets was the kind of practice where the well-heeled of Greenwich brought their pampered pussies and pooches and were happy to pay a fortune for the privilege. Nevertheless, Melissa didn't charge the astronomical prices that some of the other practices in the area did. She'd always been fair to her customers and her staff alike. Or at least, that's what Phoebe had always thought. She hadn't much liked Melissa, but she had respected her. But all that had changed yesterday. Tugging her coat tighter around her against the damply drizzled afternoon, Phoebe glanced back at her 5-year-old red Lexus, a present to herself last year, and set off along the gravel path of the Tall Trees Trail. The familiar soundtrack of birdsong and the stirring of a slight breeze through the trees and the sound of her boots on the path slowly soothed her. The air smelled of damp earth and old trees and rain, although it wasn't actually raining, more like a very fine mist, which Phoebe was glad of because it meant she had the place virtually to herself. As she walked, she felt the tightness in her shoulders lessen, and the headache, which she'd only been half aware was there, slowly fade. It felt so good to be back in her forest. Her forest. Despite the circumstances, the fact that she still saw it as her forest made her smile. Most of the New Forest, once the province of kings and queens who had hunted deer and wild boar there, still belonged to the crown. It had been proclaimed a royal forest by William the Conqueror and had featured in the Domesday Book, although now it was free to anyone who wanted to walk in an untouched, beautiful ancient woodland. These days you were more likely to see ponies or donkeys grazing on the patches of heathland than other animals, the rights of common pasture still being recognised. Her parents had been thrilled when God's Hill had become part of the New Forest National Park. Her father was particularly pleased because it had put up the value of their house, which was now, according to the local estate agents, in a very desirable hamlet. Phoebe felt herself relax a little more as she walked. She had been brought up here. She and her younger brother Fraser had spent their childhood with the forest as their backyard. She hadn't realised how much she'd missed it. There were plenty of parks in London. There was a lot more green space in the capital than she'd ever imagined, but it wasn't like this. London was much tamer and more civilised, and there were always people. You were never more than 6 feet away from a rat in London, or so the saying went, but Phoebe had been much more aware of the fact that you were rarely more than 6 feet away from a person in London. In fact, 6 inches was probably nearer the mark. And of course there were the rats of the human variety. Her thoughts turned back to Hugh, and with it came the conundrum of what she was going to tell her parents. She wasn't an impetuous teenager anymore. She was 34. This wasn't a bust-up with a boyfriend she'd just met. She and Hugh had been living together for 6 years, happily sharing an eye-wateringly priced flat in Blackheath next to Greenwich Park, owned by his father, although they did pay him a nominal rent. Mum had even started dropping hints about buying a hat on their last couple of visits. Not that marriage had been on their agenda. Neither she nor Hugh had seen the need. Perhaps that should have told her something. But they'd both been focused on the work they loved, getting themselves established, dreaming that one day they might set up their own practice. Suddenly, Phoebe felt very relieved that they hadn't been married. What would she have done if they were? Would she still have been running away? She ran through an imaginary conversation with her mother, who she was sure would be just as upset and outraged as Phoebe had been at first. But then would come the questions. So what kind of kiss exactly was it? Did you say it was at the Christmas party? I did, yes, it was under the mistletoe, and I know that makes it sound as though it was inconsequential, a moment of madness, but it wasn't just a peck on the lips kind of kiss, Mum, that's the point. I see, and had Hugh been drinking, darling? He had, yes, we'd both had a couple. We were getting the tube home. I see. In the cool light of day, it didn't sound so bad, but it had been bad. Phoebe knew that if she hadn't been over the limit last night, she might well have left the flat then instead of this morning. She wouldn't have stayed up, pacing the kitchen with its squeaky new floor, waiting for Hugh to realise she'd left the party. For him to put 2 and 2 together because he hadn't known she'd been watching when he'd kissed Melissa. In a weird kind of way, it wasn't even the kiss that had clinched things either. Clinch being a very appropriate word, Phoebe thought now. It had been the moments just before it. Her mind flicked back to the previous night. Had it really been less than 24 hours ago? The image she'd had of Hugh and Melissa freeze-framed in her head once more. They'd been silhouetted in the doorway, close to the 6-foot Christmas tree that was festooned in silver and gold baubles, its lights flashing green, red and blue on their faces. Melissa had pointed up at the mistletoe over the doorway, and Phoebe had seen an expression on Hugh's face, a tenderness as he'd drawn the older woman into his arms and held her there for a few moments. Then he'd cupped her face in his hands, held it gently between his palms, and he'd kissed her. A lingering kiss, lips touching lips, not just once, but back and forth, not the kiss of strangers half drunk on Christmas punch, but the kiss of lovers. And Phoebe, standing in the shadows of the hallway on her way back from the restroom, had felt her heart freeze as a tumult of emotions flooded through her. Shock, disbelief, nausea, pain, and then finally anger, and she'd turned right back around and left the building. And not once had Hugh or Melissa even looked in her direction. Jolted back to the present by the ping of an alert on her phone, Phoebe was back on the forest path, and she realised that she was walking towards a trio of giant fir trees. Their dark green winter foliage, triangular-shaped, stretching into points high above her head, was silhouetted against the winter whiteness of the sky. They looked like 3 enormous Christmas trees. Some joker had hung a blood-red bauble from one of the lower branches, and as she got closer, it twirled on its string, mocking her, gaudy and brash, and out of place in the natural evergreen woodland. In the winter light it looked scarlet, the exact same colour as Cruella's blood-red lipstick. Oh, the irony. Phoebe felt another sliver of ice spike her heart. It was getting colder, despite the fact she'd been walking at a good pace. A couple of strands of her long hair had come loose from her hood and were now clinging damply to her face. She shivered. This was not helping. She spun round and headed back towards the car park, longing only for the warmth of her childhood home. Much as it hurt, maybe she should just tell her parents the truth. Chapter 2. Phoebe took the scenic route back through the forest, and it was getting towards lunchtime when she drew into Old Oak Way, the unmade road where her parents lived. There were only 4 houses in the road, all with big gardens and gates and enough space between them so that if you had a constantly barking dog, no one would have heard it. She could see that the usual Christmas lights competition amongst the residents was in full swing. The first house in the road had a Father Christmas sleigh on its roof drawn by 8 reindeer, and the one next to it had a nativity scene complete with donkeys on its front lawn. By the time dusk came, they would all be ablaze with lights. So much for saving the planet. Her own home looked a lot less flamboyant. As Phoebe drew through the double gates onto the gravel turning circle, she saw there was a string of lights draped around the front porch and icicle lights dripping from the white Tudor facade. They would be on a timer that switched on at 8. Dad wasn't mean, and he was a solicitor, so they weren't broke, but he hated wasting money. Her mother's Yaris Hybrid and Dad's electric Nissan Leaf were in the drive. She parked behind them, glad both her parents were in. At least she'd only have to explain herself once. Then she walked slowly up to the front door, which opened about 5 seconds before she reached it. Her mother was wearing a soft pink woolen jumper and trousers, and her hair was coiled up in a loose bun. There was a blob of what looked like flour on her cheek. The smell of baking drifted out into the porch. "Darling, how lovely to see you. I wasn't expecting you. We didn't say today, did we?" She glanced over Phoebe's shoulder. "Is Hugh with you?" No, he's not." Phoebe avoided her mother's eyes. "I'm not interrupting anything, am I? Shall we go in?" "Of course, come on in. It's horrible out there, isn't it? Dank. And no, you're not interrupting anything. I was just baking. Mince pies." "Typical Christmas weather," Phoebe said. "Not a snowflake in sight, and mud everywhere. It's not even that cold. No chance of a white Christmas. It's 8 degrees. She paused just inside the front door to take off her boots, which she was still wearing. "Mince pies, yummy. I've come at the right time then." She knew she was babbling on about weather and mince pies, so she didn't have to explain about Hugh. "Where's Dad?" "He's out the back sorting out some logs for the wood burner. He'll be in a minute, I expect. I'll get the kettle on." They went through the short hall and into the kitchen, which had always been the heart of the house and was where all visitors sat. It was a big square room with a conservatory off to one side that led out onto the back garden and a snug on the other side where the wood burner and sofas and television were. But not many guests got past the kitchen simply because it was so warm and welcoming. It was full of reflected light from the ivory shaker-style cupboards and a modern yellow range oven, which her mother said was the best present she had ever bought either herself or the kitchen. It was a room full of sunshine, no matter what the weather. Squarely in the centre was an oak breakfast island with high-backed stools placed around it. Phoebe perched on one. Today the island was strewn with English heritage magazines, a cake tin, and 2 wire trays of mince pies with another waiting. The oven was clearly still on, and it was hot. Luella liked baking. She said it was a great antidote to Year 3 children, and she liked to feed her guests. There was usually a cake in the tin or some tea loaf, her speciality. Today, the room smelled deliciously of short-crust pastry and sugar and spice, and on the wooden French dresser beside the door that led through to the snug, there was an uncut iced Christmas cake on a glass display stand. Phoebe's mouth watered. She loved Christmas cake. She hadn't had breakfast this morning, and she'd usually have had lunch by now, too. She wasn't one for missing meals, although she hadn't felt hungry until now. Her mother put the kettle on and made them both coffee, checked on the progress of the latest batch of mince pies, transferred a couple from one of the cooling racks to a plate, and pushed them towards Phoebe. Then she sat on a stool on the other side of the breakfast bar. "Do you want to talk, or would you rather I minded my own business?" she asked, her gaze level. "Either is good with me." "Thanks." Phoebe felt her throat tighten with emotion and gratitude. That was so typical of her mother. She was never pushy, never overbearing. She had a quiet perceptiveness about her that made her a great school teacher as well as a great mum. Even so, Phoebe knew she couldn't just turn up 3 days early for Christmas without her boyfriend and offer no explanation at all. We had a disagreement. I will tell you about it, but I'm still trying to get my head around it. She took a mince pie and bit into it. Oh my God, these are delicious. How do you get the pastry so melt in your mouth? Too much butter, I suspect, Luella said ruefully. Terribly bad for you. Not that you ever put on an ounce, do you? You don't take after me. She patted her tummy. I've put on loads lately. You wouldn't notice, Phoebe said loyally, although maybe her mother did look a little plumper. She'd always struggled with her weight. How are you, apart from busy baking? Before her mother could answer this, the kitchen door burst open and her father appeared, filling the doorway, still in his big outdoor coat and with wood shavings down his front. His cheeks were rosy and his grey hair a bit windswept. Fee, love, I thought I heard a car. Good timing. I could do with a lift. Where's that lovely man of yours? Can I borrow him? He broke off, clearly taking in his wife's shut-up expression, but blundering on anyway. Don't tell me you haven't brought him. What's up with him? Snowed under with work, I bet. Lots of sick animals at this time of year, and him too daft to turn them away. What? He said, looking between his wife and daughter. You haven't had a bust-up, have you? Dad was as loud and unsubtle as her mother was intuitive and calm, Phoebe thought, lowering her eyes and biting her lip. They said opposites attracted, and it was certainly true in her parents' case. James, her mother said, shut up. I'm shutting up. He mimed a zipping motion across his lips. There, I've shut up. Come and give your old man a hug, Angel. Phoebe got off her stool and did as he said, and it felt so good to be swept into one of her dad's bear hugs. None of her family was small. Both Phoebe and her mother were 5'10", and her brother topped 6 foot. But her dad was big as well as being tall, and his hug took her breath away. You're looking a bit skinny, Angel, Dad said when they drew apart. And peaky. You've been working too hard, haven't you? Wait until I see that Hugh. He should be taking better care of you. Out of the corner of her eye, Phoebe saw her mother roll her eyes. But to be fair, it was hard to shut that up. He wore his heart on his sleeve. He always had, and he wasn't very good at editing what came out of his mouth. He was better at work. He was a family solicitor, a very successful one. According to her mother, his clients loved the fact that he was so completely authentic and honest and never tried to pull the wool over anyone's eyes. We had a tiff, Phoebe told him, and I was cross, so I left early. That's basically the situation. Her father's warm brown eyes met hers. Oh dear, oh dear. His brow furrowed, and he put his hands up in front of him, a little gesture of surrender. Your mother's right, though. I talk too much. I'm going to let you two ladies catch up for a bit. I've got some logs to sort out. He pinched a mince pie, much to her mother's chagrin, and backed out of the room. Phoebe looked at her mother, who was shaking her head. God love him, the older woman said, before getting up and going to the oven to liberate the last batch of mince pies, which she transferred to a cooling rack before sitting down again without speaking. For a moment, the only sounds were the ticking of the kitchen clock and the hum of the fridge and the occasional bang from the room next door as James sorted out his logs. Phoebe crossed and uncrossed her legs, and then finally she said, It was a bit more than a tiff. Hugh kissed our boss at the Christmas party. She relayed the whole story, and Luella didn't say anything until Phoebe got to the part where Hugh had come home an hour after she had, very drunk and not very apologetic, and then her mum reached a hand across the breakfast bar in reassurance and said, In your shoes, I'd have walked out on him too. Would you, Mum? Phoebe felt relieved for the first time and a little bit vindicated. Yes, darling. That's bad behaviour, even if he was drunk, and I'm surprised at him. She leaned forward. But it's what's happened since that's important. What has happened since? Nothing much. We had a blazing row when he got in. He said I was overreacting. He'd just had one too many beers, which always makes him more touchy-feely. I'm not even sure if he realised I'd seen them. I made him sleep in the spare room last night. Not that I got much sleep, as you can imagine. And this morning I left before he got up. I was still fuming, Mum, not least because none of it seemed to have affected Hugh's sleep. He was snoring his head off. There was a little pause. I'm not surprised you're angry, but you are going to have to talk to him sooner or later. Yes, I know. Has he phoned you? Her mum asked. He sent me a message saying we needed to talk and that he was sorry. But you haven't responded. No, not yet. I wanted to clear my head. I stopped for a walk in the forest on the way. Remembering the scarlet Christmas bauble, she swallowed an ache in her throat. The only conclusion I've come to so far is that I probably shouldn't have left before we talked properly, but I did. And I'm certainly not driving all the way back there again. I can understand that, darling, but maybe it isn't such a bad plan to get some perspective. A couple of days apart will probably help. My timing's not great, though, is it? What with it being so close to Christmas. Phoebe felt a tear roll down her cheek. I should still be at work. I phoned in sick this morning. Neither was his, love. Don't beat yourself up. And there was such kindness in her mother's voice and such compassion that Phoebe felt more tears gathering. She should have known her family would be in her corner, no matter what. There's nothing that can't be sorted with a bit of time and perspective, her mother added. And coffee and some decent food. Now, have you eaten anything? Aside from mince pies, I mean. I can do you a sandwich. We've got some nice ham. I can do my own sandwich, Phoebe said, standing up. Thanks, Mum. I'll get my bag from the car. Then I'll come back and do a ham sandwich. Then I'll think about phoning Hugh. That sounds like a plan, Luella said. Chapter 3. It wasn't much of a plan, Phoebe thought, as she went outside to her car, but it was better than nothing. She looked up at the white-walled, double-gabled house with its 2 chimneys and dark-tiled roof. Directly above her head, in the left-hand gable, was what had once been her bedroom window, and she felt the same rush of pleasure she always felt when she looked at her family home. She was so incredibly lucky to have been brought up in such an idyllic place. And she loved the fact that her parents still lived here and hadn't downsized, which was what so many of her friends' parents had done, which meant she could still come back here, a time out of time, an oasis of love and calm. Not that she hadn't been happy in London, although it hadn't always been that way. She'd been homesick when she'd first moved away. She'd gone straight from sixth form, where she'd done her A-levels, to the London vet school, which had been a complete and utter culture shock, although her homesickness had been offset by the excitement of getting a place in such an esteemed school. The London vet school was one of the best places in the country to train. She'd needed A grades in biology, chemistry and maths even to be considered, plus A grades at GCSE level, not to mention a shed load of relevant experience which she'd got by doing placements at various vets and farms around the New Forest, thanks in part to her grandparents and their connections. Her maternal grandparents, Maggie and Pete Crowther, known to everyone as Maggie and Farmer Pete, had been dairy farmers for most of their lives at Puddleduck Farm, which was half an hour from God's Hill, and had been in the family for 4 generations. Puddleduck Farm had got its unusual name, apparently, because Phoebe's maternal great-grandmother Charlotte had been a fan of Beatrix Potter, and had been given a pair of ducks as a wedding present from her maid of honour. Rumour had it that a tradition had grown up around the gift. As long as there were puddle ducks at the farm and one of them was called Jemima, the business would always prosper. The farm's name had been changed at around the same time. It had previously been called Forest Farm. Charlotte had clearly been as strong and as feisty as her only daughter Maggie to have instigated this name change to her husband's farm. All Phoebe knew was that her grandparents had certainly taken the tradition seriously. There were still ducks at the farm. One of them was probably still called Jemima. Phoebe smiled, her head full of fond memories. She and Fraser had spent summer holidays and weekends there as soon as they were old enough to be sensible around the animals and not get under my feet. These were her grandmother's words. Maggie Crowther wasn't your average grandmother. For a start, She preferred to be called Maggie by everyone, even her grandchildren, especially her grandchildren. Being called Nana or Gran, or heaven forbid, Granny, would have made her feel old, she had proclaimed with a shudder. Maggie Crowther was a force of nature. Fair-haired and diminutive, she was the only one of her family who'd missed out on the height gene. She was 5'4", but what she lacked in height, she made up for in strength and attitude. "I can fling hay bales onto a lorry faster than any man," she was fond of telling anyone who'd listen, and back in the day there hadn't been a man on the farm who'd dare argue with her. Phoebe doubted many people would argue with her grandmother these days either. They'd have got short shrift, and possibly would have been chased with a pitchfork. Phoebe might have been scared of her too, if she hadn't loved her so much. Farmer Pete had been less averse to the idea of the kids, especially Phoebe, calling him grandpops when Maggie wasn't listening. He had died suddenly 12 years ago from a stroke a few months after he'd retired. Phoebe had been just 22, and she still missed him badly. Maggie had dealt with the grief of losing her husband and soulmate by looking after animals, or at least that's what Luella had always said, and Phoebe was inclined to agree with her. Puddleduck wasn't a dairy farm anymore. There had been no one left in the family who wanted to farm, but it was still home to a selection of stray animals that her grandmother had taken in across the years. The first donkey, or Neddie, as Maggie called them, had turned up just after Farmer Pete had died. He'd been skinny and malnourished, with a sore on his flank, and Maggie had nursed him back to health and had never found his owner. Not that Phoebe suspected she'd tried very hard. He'd been joined by Roxy, made homeless when her owner had died, and because of that, Maggie's impromptu animal rescue shelter had become known affectionately by the locals as New Forest Neddies. A handful of dogs and cats had joined the Neddies, who went up and down in number, but the name had stuck. Phoebe felt a sudden urge to go and see if her grandmother was all right. She would be busy with the animals. She always was. Despite the fact that she was 72, she never sat down. New Forest Neddies was a full-time job. She didn't have much time for sitting down. But Phoebe knew she'd neglected her grandmother lately, too caught up in her own life to check up on her. She felt guilty that she'd been so neglectful. Maggie wouldn't be around forever. Maybe she should go now before she took everything into the house. She glanced at her vet bag and wondered whether to take that inside first. The car was usually its permanent home, always on hand and packed in case of an emergency. They were bigger than most people assumed. They had to be to get everything in them. Bandages, local anaesthetic, needles, saline flushes, suturing kit, stethoscope, and all manner of other paraphernalia. For as long as she could remember, Phoebe had wanted to be a vet. While other children had played with dolls, Phoebe had collected miniature plastic and china animals, horses and donkeys, dogs, cats, rabbits. She'd even had a little raccoon with a furry tail that had been part of a fridge magnet brought back by one of her friends from a holiday in America. She'd performed pretend operations, converting a shoebox to an operating theatre and wheeling the animals in and out on a toy ambulance stolen from her brother. All of her operations, whether she had been delivering an imaginary litter of kittens or treating a fractured leg on a horse, had been successful. She'd looked after the toy animals as carefully as if they were real animals. There had been real animals too, who'd received the same loving care. They'd never been able to have a dog or cat at home because Dad was allergic, but she'd had guinea pigs and rabbits in the garden. Dad had made the hutches and an interconnected playground of runs for them that could be moved around the lawn to make up for the fact that she couldn't have the dogs she'd dreamed of. Her mother had praised her for being the only child she'd ever met who'd promised to clean them out every day and who had actually kept her promise. The memory was bittersweet. It felt weird being back here at her family home, especially without Hugh. Phoebe knew she would never have stayed away from the forest so long if it hadn't been for him. When she'd qualified just over 10 years ago, her first job had been at a practice in Camberley, which wasn't quite commutable for the hours she worked, but had meant she could visit home at weekends. Hugh had worked there from time to time as a locum, but it had been a long while before she'd got to know him properly. The tall, handsome young man, who was as passionate about animals as she was, had been shy around women, but he'd eventually asked her out, and they had fallen in love. A slow burn kind of love, based on mutual respect and friendship, Phoebe had thought when she looked back. The best kind of love. When Hugh had said he'd got a permanent job at the prestigious City Vets in Greenwich and that he could get her one too, she'd hesitated to move even further away from the New Forest and into the city. But somehow London and her love of Hugh had become intertwined, and so it hadn't been such a wrench to move there permanently.
Working at a top London practice will look great on our CVs, whatever we do in the future,
Hugh had said, his eyes shining with enthusiasm.
I know you love the countryside, but we can visit.
And that's how it had been for the past 6 years. London had become familiar, her second home, and living in his father's amazing flat together had been the icing on the cake. Luckily, her family had loved him too. Even Maggie had liked him, and she was renowned for getting on better with animals than she did with people. They were far less trouble because they were reliable and didn't bore you senseless with their chatter, was something else she was fond of saying. A flicker of indecision tugged at Phoebe's heart. She needed to phone Hugh, but maybe she should drive over and see Maggie first. She wavered. Or should she leave that until tomorrow? She was suddenly torn. The practice closed early on a Saturday, but that didn't mean Hugh would have gone straight home. He may have taken her sickie at face value. He may not even know yet that she'd left London. She was still wavering when her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the front door opening, and she saw her father silhouetted in the oblong of light that spilled out onto the porch.
Are you okay out here, Angel? Is there anything I can help you with?
I'm fine, Dad. It's all good. Phoebe made a decision. She would get settled in first and spend some time with her parents before she dashed off to see Maggie. She leaned into the back of her car and grabbed the overnight bag and the carrier of presents. Although you could take these in if you like, Dad. Thanks. She handed him the bag. They need putting under the tree. He looked pleased to have something useful to do as he crunched across the drive to help and took the bag from her outstretched hand. Phoebe followed him back into the house. It probably had been the wrong thing to do, making the mad dash down here. She should have stayed and talked things through with Hugh. They might have sorted things out, and her parents would never have needed to know. Instead, she had just complicated everything by running away. But she decided Mum was right. A few days' time and perspective was what she needed. Phoebe, there's a sandwich here for you, her mother called through to the snug once she and her father had added her presents to the growing pile under the tree by the fireplace. And I've switched the radiator back on in your room. I hadn't quite got as far as making the bed up, but there's fresh linen in the airing cupboard. Use the blue set. Thanks, Mum, I'll do that now. Phoebe paused in the kitchen doorway. I'm just going to try Hugh. The sandwich was on the side, but she didn't feel hungry anymore. The prospect of speaking to Hugh had stolen her appetite. She picked up the plate, not wanting to disappoint her mother. I'll take it with me. She hesitated. Before I go, is Maggie okay? Maggie's fine, love. Her mother paused from putting mince pies into tins and glanced at her. I spoke to her yesterday. Why do you ask? I haven't kept in touch as much lately as I used to. I feel a bit guilty. You're busy with your own life, love. It's natural. You've grown up and moved on. That's how it should be. She frowned. It doesn't help that she doesn't really do technology, does it? I've been trying to persuade her to at least carry a smartphone, but she's adamant she doesn't need one. You know what she's like. New-fangled nonsense, Phoebe parroted her grandmother's voice. Yes, I know. Hugh and I bought her a smartphone for her birthday, and we set it up for her. I bet it went straight back in its box as soon as we'd left the farm. I wouldn't take it personally. Fraser and Alexa bought her an Amazon Fire Stick so she could turn her TV into a smart telly and watch those old reruns of Fawlty Towers and Keeping Up Appearances that she loves. Alexa had been Fraser's childhood sweetheart and now, to the whole family's delight, because she really was a sweetheart, she was his wife. They'd been married 18 months. They thought it would be a huge hit, Luella continued, but I think she put that in the bin. She lidded the tins of the mince pies and stacked them on the dresser alongside the Christmas cake. I must admit I do worry about her over on that farm, now she's older. It was better when Eddie was living in the van. Eddie had been a former farmhand who'd kept his fully fitted-out trailer on a patch of land at Puddleduck Farm, permanently plugged into the electrics and water rent-free in return for doing odd jobs around the place. What happened to Eddie? I thought he was still there. Phoebe felt a pang of sadness. The old man had looked about 90 the last time she'd seen him. He didn't die, did he? No, he went to live with his son in Southampton. Oh, good. Phoebe felt a surge of relief. Maggie still sees him occasionally. He comes on the coach to Ringwood. He's deaf as a post these days, and he's not so steady on his feet, but he still has all his marbles, and he's always had a soft spot for your grandmother. I know he has. It was amazing, Phoebe reflected, quite how many people did have a soft spot for Maggie, considering the fact that she regularly said the planet would be a much better place if it had less humans on it and more animals. I'm looking forward to seeing her, Phoebe said. But first, I'll go and phone Hugh. She couldn't put this off any longer, but she was not looking forward to it one bit. Chapter 4. Upstairs, Phoebe collected the bed linen from the airing cupboard and went into her old room. Her parents weren't the sort of people who kept the kids' bedrooms as they'd always been in case of visits. They were used for other things these days. Fraser's, which was the biggest, had been turned into a home gym when her father had decided it would be cheaper to work out at home than go to an expensive venue, and he'd bought an exercise bike and a treadmill and some weights from eBay a couple of years ago. Phoebe bet they were all gathering dust. Her father was far too much of a socialite to want to work out on his own, no matter how much money he saved by cancelling his gym membership. Her bedroom, she saw as she pushed open the door, had become even more of a dumping ground for things which had no other home since the last time she'd seen it. There was a laptop case and a box of paperwork on the floor that looked as though it was teaching paraphernalia, and a pile of books and other clutter on the little desk that now took up the space where her dressing table had once stood. The wardrobe with its full-length mirror was still in situ, though, and the pretty floral wallpaper was the same. The small double bed with its white iron bedstead was free of clutter. Phoebe made it up with the blue linen, then sat on it and hooked out her phone. She couldn't put it off any longer. Taking a deep breath, she speed-dialed Hugh. The phone rang several times, and she imagined him in their flat, picking it up, finding his earbuds, putting them in place, settling himself down. Then, finally, he answered it.
Hi, thanks for ringing. Where are you?
Straight to the point, as usual. I'm at my parents'.
Ah.
There was a world of meaning in that ah.
I thought you might have gone to Letty's.
He hoped she had, Phoebe thought, because that would have been less terminal. Letty and Graham were friends of theirs. Well, they were more friends of Hugh's, and they lived just outside the city. It was probably the only other place she might go where she'd have needed to take her car. He clearly hadn't checked, though, or he'd have known she wasn't there. Did you go into work? She asked him.
I did, yes.
Phoebe felt a stab of pain and jealousy at the thought that he'd been working with Melissa all day. Presumably they'd have talked about the night before. She wondered how that had gone. She imagined that Melissa would have been concerned, as well as irritated that they were a vet down, and that Hugh would have been consoling her.
Don't worry, she'll calm down. She just overreacted. A Christmas kiss. These things happen.
Phoebe's stomach twisted in pain. I saw you and Melissa under the mistletoe. In the hall, she added, so there could be no doubt what she was talking about. I know what you said last night, but it didn't look like a drunken kiss from where I was standing.
Ah,
he said again. There was a long pause, and she closed her eyes. Why wasn't he jumping in to explain? Then he said,
I really didn't want to have this conversation on the phone, Phoebe.
Well, unless you're going to drive here, we don't have a lot of choice, do we?
No, I guess we don't.
She could hear him breathing.
I'm not driving there.
His voice was cold. She felt a little stab of shock. I see. I'm not worth a couple of hours of your time.
It's not that.
Now she could hear movement in the background. He sounded as though he was pacing their kitchen. She could hear the squeak of the new flooring. He must be agitated. He only ever paced if he was really stressed. Good. He deserved to be stressed.
As I said, Phoebe, I really didn't want to have this conversation on the phone, but here we are. I'm sorry. I'm really sorry you had to find out like that, but I've been seeing Melissa for a while.
His words, so calmly and quietly spoken, sent a shard of ice straight to her heart, and she was sure for a few seconds that she hadn't heard him right, or that she hadn't understood him right. The whole room seemed to freeze frame in her head. An old picture on the wall of her cuddling a red setter, carefree and happy at Puddleduck Farm, blurred, and the desk clutter wobbled as she blinked. Her heart was thundering so loudly in her ears that she couldn't breathe. But then, when she did speak, all she could hear was her own ragged breathing. You what? What do you mean you've been seeing her?
We didn't plan it. I promise you that. It just...
Don't say it just happened, she broke across him. These things don't just happen. They're choices that we make. We don't just suddenly fall into bed with people. Oh my God, have you been to bed with her?
No, I haven't. Nothing like that. We've just dated.
What do you mean you've dated? You live with me. How can you have dated someone else? She could hear her own voice rising in horror. What on earth was he talking about? Hugh sighed.
Dated is the wrong word. We've connected, and we've been out a few times for dinner and such like.
But when? How? She was completely thrown. This was so not what she'd been expecting. She'd been expecting him to apologize, yes, but not for something like this. She'd been expecting him to say that at worst he'd just got too drunk, he didn't drink much usually, that he'd let his hair down. Everyone had been working really hard and their job could be so stressful. She'd been expecting a scenario that had run along the lines of her imagined conversation with her mother, a storm in a teacup that could be resolved, a situation in which she might have been prepared to admit that she may have overreacted by flying back home. She might even have apologized for being so impulsive, after he'd grovelled enough, that was. But she had never, in her worst nightmares, anticipated this.
I didn't go to see the new James Bond film with Graham,
Hugh continued quietly. She had thought that was odd at the time when he'd said it, that either of them had liked James Bond, but she hadn't questioned him. No wonder he'd asked if she'd gone to Letty and Graham's. Graham must have been covering for him. You took Melissa to see James Bond? Phoebe hadn't had her down as a Bond fan. An art house film fan, maybe, the type that she didn't much care for.
No, I lied about James Bond. I'm sorry. We just went for a meal.
And Graham covered for you?
No, Graham didn't know. I just took a flyer that you wouldn't ask him.
Bloody hell, that was so out of character. She couldn't believe she was hearing this. She had never known Hugh to do anything that wasn't carefully thought out, planned, and then meticulously executed. I see. She didn't see. Okay, Hugh hated confrontation, and he wasn't one for showing his emotions, but this was cold, even for Hugh. None of this made any sense.
I'm so sorry, Phoebe.
He was still pacing. She could hear his footsteps again, the squeak of their flooring. A familiar sound in a world that had suddenly become so very unfamiliar.
We were going to tell you, but we didn't want to wreck your Christmas.
Well, how very bloody considerate of you both. So what did you plan to do? Come down here and play happy families with my parents and act like everything was fine and then spring it on me at New Year?
No, God, I don't know. I haven't thought it through. Like I said, we didn't plan it to happen. Oh shit, what a mess.
The squeaking had stopped, but then Phoebe heard another sound in the background, as if someone, it sounded like a woman, had just cleared their throat. An awful thought struck her. What if Hugh wasn't the one doing the pacing? What if it was Melissa who was there, walking up and down in their kitchen? She hadn't thought she could feel any worse than she did, but she'd been wrong. Is she there with you? Is Melissa there now? She is, isn't she? She's there listening to our private conversation. Geez, Hugh, you are unbelievable. She disconnected the call. Her fingers were shaking so much that it was hard to hit the red button on her smartphone. For a few seconds, Phoebe sat still on the bed. The shaking that had started in her fingers had spread to her insides, but the overwhelming emotion that she felt was no longer shock. It was anger. How dare he invite Melissa into their home the moment she wasn't there? How dare he think he could sit there, refusing even to drive here and discuss this face to face like any other decent human being would have done, like the man who'd always professed to love her would have done? She snatched up the phone again and pressed redial. This time he answered it almost immediately. He probably thought she'd disconnected by accident. She'd never hung up on him in her life. "You can tell Melissa Green she can stick her job where the sun doesn't shine," she yelled at him, "and she needn't expect me to work out my notice either." She disconnected again before he had time to answer. For a few seconds, Phoebe was aware only of the anger and of the adrenaline that was coursing around her body. Her heart pounded with it, and her head throbbed to the same beat in a relentless accompaniment. Every part of her was shaking. She felt as though every atom of her being was shaking. Feeling hot and sick and somehow cold and shivery at the same time, she sat where she was, trying to control the trembling, trying to process what had just happened. For maybe half a minute, she stared into space.